Before we wrap up for the evening, and we are quickly running out of time, a note for us all from our buddy Dr. John in New York. Sunday was something besides Abraham Lincoln's birthday. It was another birthday. One not as widely noted, but probably deserved as much or more celebration. Dr. John in New York writes, Bob, as you probably know, Sunday marked the 203rd anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth. I wanted to offer some thoughts on this remarkable man and his legacy. I don't consider myself a scientist. The sorts of things that I'm interested in studying don't lend themselves to hypothesis testing and formal theorizing. Nevertheless, Darwin is one of my scientific heroes, for one reason. His theory of natural selection is, quite simply, beautifully elegant. What do I mean by that? In science, a theory is judged to be elegant when it makes a minimum of assumptions and then explains a great deal of things. Natural selection is perhaps the most elegant theory in the history of science. It starts with two self-evident observations. One, a certain amount of variation exists within the biological traits of an animal population. Some woodpeckers have longer beaks than others, for example. And two, not every member of a population survives to reproduce. It then makes one very simple but critical assumption. Biological traits become more or less common due to differential survival and reproduction. One simple, critical assumption. Biological traits become more or less common due to differential survival and reproduction. From that one assumption, says Dr. John, it explains pretty much everything about the history of life on Earth. Stop and think about that for a second. From one tiny assumption to basically infinite explanation. It is staggering to think of how simple it is, really. Perhaps that's the problem. Natural selection seems so obvious, its workings are so subtle, so commonsensical, that it doesn't appear to be working at all. And remember that Darwin came up with all this in a time when we were completely ignorant of genetics. Genes are the very mechanism of natural selection. They're what carries the variation that results in those different physical traits. For Darwin to, write this one down, for Darwin to explain natural selection without knowing how it works is something akin to envisioning the Indianapolis 500 before the wheel is invented. It's amazing as well to think that Darwin was 22 years old when he set off on the HMS Beagle for what became a 5-year voyage around the world. And you wonder where that line, its 5-year mission, came from. It took him until 1858, 22 years after his return to England, to publish the theory. And it came about largely because a naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace was preparing a paper saying nearly the same things Darwin was thinking. So papers by Darwin and Wallace were both presented to a London Scientific Society on the same day. Imagine being there. It would have seemed like just an ordinary day with no sense that everything people thought about nature and humanity's place in it was being rocked. Wallace, incidentally, embraced spiritualism soon after, but he was also a socialist and an activist for women's suffrage and against militarism. It is a sad commentary on the contemporary U.S. that Darwin needs explaining and defending. Roger Ebert wrote a post honoring Darwin on his 200th anniversary. He makes reference to a previous column from a few years back that had gotten something like 150,000 comments. He claims to have read each of them, and that practically none of the anti-Darwin crowd came from outside the U.S. intelligent design group. Intelligent design, he concludes, is basically an American preoccupation. John notes, there are people in my field who have tried to jump on the Darwin bandwagon, applying natural selection to explain variation in Native American artifacts. Yeah, it's just as dumb as it sounds. Dr. John, I will remind you, is an archaeologist. And there is a crowd called sociobiologists who like to look for evolutionary reasons to explain, for example, why men rape women. As you can imagine, that gets us to a really dark place really quickly. But none of that, says Dr. John, invalidates Darwin's contribution or the sheer beauty of his theory. You can't say Darwin in this neck of the woods without having some idiot, ill-informed jackass spit on the ground and talk, he's just trying to disprove the existence of God's what he's trying to do, Darwin. I didn't come from no monkey. That's not what it's about at all, is it? An elegant explanation for virtually every aspect of life on this little blue-green marble of a time machine hurtling through the universe. It's kind of nice to close out Moran Monday with an example of what's not one.